So I want to kind of talk tonight about three kind of areas. One is around what is this thing called culture, because it's so nebulous. What is this thing that we talk about culture? How do we kind of define it, and why is it important? So let's just kind of quickly give you a couple of quick definitions on culture. Right? So the largest study on culture was done by a Dutch anthropologist called Gert Hofstede. You may have heard or read some of his literature, and he defines culture as the collective programming of the mind. Here's the definition that I kind of came up with, which is what I work on. It's actually the lenses through which that you look out at the world. So you carry your culture with you. It's like a backpack, and it's invisible, but it influences how you look out at the world. Culture is important because it shapes your psychological makeup. So where you grew up, your early influences, your values. If you think about that, you learned your early values from your parents, your schools, your teachers, your grandparents. And the reason they taught you the values of how to behave, they taught you the norms, was because they wanted you to fit into that particular culture. We do that with our children. We teach them the rules of the game because we want them to fit in. When we talk about culture, what we're meaning here is that culture is actually, we learn our culture. We learn it. And it's specific to groups, to categories. Culture is just the way we kind of operate. But of course, everyone's an individual. 7 billion people, no one has the same fingerprints as you. You are unique. No one has had the same experience as you have at this present moment of time. So culture is just one of those things that we carry with us. And as an individual, we have nuances of how we shift and shape. When I am with my family, my personal culture comes into play. When I am at work, my organizational comes into play. And when I'm traveling, my national culture comes into play. And you are at the core of all those three. And at different times, it becomes more important. Okay? And we have it all in all of us. So the reason why we need to understand our own culture is that when we look at another culture, when we look at the behavior of another culture, we interpret that behavior through our own values, through our own norms, through our own perspectives. Culture is always relative. It's what are you comparing it against? And culture is always subjective. It's subjective, based on your own reference points. Okay, what are you using as your own reference points? What are you using as your core values? So I want to touch now on just kind of 5 key dimensions, which I think would be important for you in terms of dealing with your mentees. One is the relationship and task orientation. Do you know, in certain cultures, it's really important to get a good relationship before we get to task. In other cultures, the focus is on getting the task done. Because once we get the task done, then we have time to build a relationship. When we are kind of spending time on wanting to build relationship, think of the behaviors that we engage in when we want to spend time looking at relationship building. And the interpretation that behavior could have if you are much more task-focused. Somebody who comes from a task-focused operation or a relationship person comes into a task-focused culture and spends time asking questions, they come across as being totally unprofessional. It's the interpretation of that particular behavior. Here's the next dimension, which I think may be useful for you to think about, which is around shame and guilt. Shame-oriented cultures feel the question that kind of comes up for them in the back of their mind is, what will other people think? What will other people think of my behavior? Compared to a guilt-based culture who will say, actually, I don't care what other people think. It's about what I want. Collectivism versus individualism. Group-oriented cultures. In group-oriented cultures, parents say this to their children. Okay. The nail that sticks up gets beaten down. The duck that makes the most amount of noise gets shot. So the message is really around fitting in. Fit in. Highly individualistic cultures. People get told, right? Stand up and be encountered, right? The squeaky door gets the oil. Draw attention. You want something done? Make some noise. Highly individualistic, speaking up, having a point of view. Hierarchy versus equality. In hierarchical cultures, we pay respect and attention to people who are older, to people who've got qualifications, to people who, we believe, people who come from a hierarchical culture believe that society is vertical. Titles are really important. Business cards are really important because they help me assess where you fit in the hierarchy. What about equality-based cultures? Equality-based cultures believe that society is horizontal. We flatten it. Don't call me by title, call me by my first name. I may be 40 years older than you, but call me by my first name. You don't need to call me professor, you don't need to call me sir, just call me by my first name. And the difficulty sometimes that creates for people. And finally, high context, low context. It's around communication styles. So, in high context cultures, the messaging is not just in the words. It's in what I say, it's in the tone of my voice, it's in the pitch, it's in my facial expressions, it's in my body language, it's how I hold my body. Whereas in low context cultures, you listen to my words, right? I mean what I say. Yes is yes, no is no. Whereas here, yes may mean yes, yes may mean no, and yes may mean maybe. It depends on how I say the yes. So, one of the challenges is if you come from a low context culture and you are used to listening and hearing people say no, when you speak to someone from a high context culture, even though they are saying no to you, you don't hear it. You don't hear it because you're not attuned to hear it. So when someone goes, that taking of the breath, that which are all that non-verbal, this will be difficult. Everybody from high context knows that's a no. But someone from a low context will mean difficult? What do you mean? How difficult will it be? What do you need? How can I support you to get this done? So it's not just in the communication, but actually it's in the listening. It's how do we listen? How do we have different styles of listening? How do we actually hear the no when someone doesn't say no? Okay? So those are 5 kind of dimensions which I've kind of put there for you to kind of consider in terms of your mentoring and mentoring style. And think about where you sit on that dimension. Where are you? What's your preference? It's a preference. Where's your preference? And how do you now learn to operate across both? I mean, how do you build your repertoire? So, is it binary? No. But how do you build your repertoire? So how do you kind of be high context and low context when the situation requires it? That's the challenge. We are taking in so much information per day. Your brain is taking in something like 11 million pieces of information per day. That is so much to take in. And we are only conscious of about 40 to 50 bits of information. So that's how the brain kind of works, because it's the way we make sense. And 80% of the time, 90% of the time, we're working on what we call, or what Daniel Kahneman calls in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, System 1 thinking. System 1 thinking is it's intuitive, it's fast, it's quick, we don't pay attention, we just make stuff up as we go. Every so often, you need to pause and move into System 2 thinking, which is really about taking time, thinking about it, and planning, and being analytical. So, some of the common biases you have: affinity bias. Affinity bias means I like to hang out with people who are similar to me. Why is that? Because I trust people who are similar to me. Same is safe, different is dangerous. Same is safe, different is dangerous. It's something that's part of inherent about being a human being. I'm looking for similarity. I'm looking for people. Now, it may not be culture. That's why people in culture stick together. Sometimes the sameness is in universities, right? Sometimes it's in the department. Sometimes it's the suburb that we live in. Sometimes it's our hobbies. But we're always seeking people with whom we have affinity. And we do that automatically. Or it's like your radar. Think of a social event at a barbecue. Think of the range of questions you go through when you first meet someone. You are looking for affinity. Because at least you go, we now have a common subject that we can talk about. It's inherent in all human beings. All human beings. Which is one of the issues when it comes to recruitment. You know, when you look at CVs, what are some of the things you're looking out for? All those things that come so much. That's why there's so much work now being done around conscious and unconscious bias. If you look at all the work around diversity and inclusion in the last 20 years, of all the firms that have spent hundreds and thousands of dollars on this, is now the last 2 years, 3 years, there's just so much focus on this. Okay? We make decisions based on affinity bias. Look at this picture up here. Tell me, who are those people? Shout them out. Obama, Thatcher, yeah, yep, and Attenborough. Very good, man. You guys are a very bright group of people. I can say that to you. Is that what you saw? So you can see the eyes have been altered, right? The lips have been altered. But guess what? Even with that alteration, you recognize them, right? You were able to recognize them. Why is that? It's embedded in you, right? You see them everywhere. Very good, Adam. So do I need to have a lot of information? No. I just need a little bit. I go, yep, I've met somebody like this person before. I know someone who talks like this. I've met someone of this age. I've met someone from that country. I know that. I don't need to know this guy. I've met somebody like that. Even if I've never met that person, I'll make it up. Right? I just take a little bit of information and I make the story out of it. Because as a human being, I need to have a narrative. I can't work in a vacuum. My brain doesn't work in a vacuum. I need to make a narrative. I need to make a story. And I create that in my mind. I use kind of, what do I have? And I create this. So the first thing that we notice about a person, the first thing we notice is skin color. That's the first thing you notice, right? In 1/100th of a second. The second thing you notice is gender. The third thing you notice is age or generational diversity. And the fourth thing you notice is disability. Those are what we call the major fault lines above the waterline, if you think of an iceberg, and all the other differences that's below, right? So confirmation bias is really around, it's what I think, I'm looking for information that supports me. And even when I see evidence that is contrary to my belief, I just don't see it. I just don't see it. Okay? And this bias is called contrast effect bias. Contrast effect bias is when we are looking at comparison. If you look at the center circle, so which center circle looks bigger? Which one looks bigger? Right? Yeah, the one on this side on the left looks bigger, but they're both the same. Why does the one on the left look bigger? Because it's surrounded by smaller circles, right? How does that play out for us every day? How does that play out? Think of this in terms of selection. Think of this in terms of your team. Think of this in terms of students. How does it play out? Mm-hmm.
So you have people who are inferior or at a lower cadre, so you feel like you're superior to them,
Mm-hmm.
and you can train them.
Yep.
And for some people say like they are not equally fit for the job because they don't match the criteria. And if you put more stress for myself, so I want someone as equal as me. So the cultural differences of inheritance and our decision making and judgment and protection, everything comes into play.
Good. Because it's,
We are doing a recruitment.
that's right. So who are we comparing it with? Who am I comparing you against? Right? What are my standards that I'm using? And we do this automatically. Automatically. So we need to be really conscious of this in terms of our decision making. Finally, I want to finish off with what are the 4 key capabilities of building cultural intelligence. There are 4 of them. The first thing is drive. And drive refers to what is it that makes you interested in multicultural interactions. For some people, it's intrinsic. They just have an interest. You know, they grew up with it. They just have an interest in people of different cultures. They love multicultural situations. They love trying different foods. They love traveling. Intrinsic. For other people, it's very extrinsic, which means the reason I do it is because it gives me a promotion. It's a higher status in my firm. It gives me a better title. It's part of my development as I go into the organization, etc. Very important for you to be able to establish what is your driver. You know, why is it that you are interested in multicultural situations? The second box, moving towards the right, is knowledge. Depending on the cultural groups that you are working with, you obviously need to build some knowledge, right? What are the similarities and what are the differences? We talked about 5 dimensions. There are 9 dimensions in the book, but you can read so much. You can get so much information out on Google. Get some information about cultural differences. You know, where are your mentees from? Learn something about that country so that you at least have some commonality around it, okay? Knowledge is critical. Strategy is really around planning, awareness, and checking. How do I plan what I'm going to do? How do I plan my interactions? When I work with clients who are traveling to other parts of the world, strategy becomes, okay, what's our plan for going forward? I'm currently working with a law firm. They went into Singapore 3 years ago, and they're really struggling getting local business in Singapore. So when I asked them, well, why did you expand to Singapore in the first place? Like, what was your motivation? They said, well, some of our clients moved over there. So we knew we would have business, right? That made sense. But they forgot to have a strategy on how to generate local business, because having the business from here wasn't enough to sustain their office, right? So strategy was poor. And finally, the area where most of us fall is really around action, okay? Action. How do we execute what we know? So I may know a lot about different cultures. I may be a great strategist. I'm really motivated. But how do I execute? How do I listen carefully? How do I learn to pause? How do I use silence? How do I modulate my tonalities? How do I use my body better? How do I paraphrase? How do I ask better questions? Because that's where the rubber meets the road. Your cultural intelligence is in your actions. It's how you act. It's your behavior. Okay, that's the proof in the pudding. So, let me take a couple of minutes now at your tables. Let me just give you a few minutes to just discuss some of the things we've talked about here. And are there any questions that you can generate at your tables? Okay, just take a few minutes to do that.